Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and I'm filming this video shortly after the passing of Pope Francis on Easter Monday 2025. You know, when a Pope passes away, it's an event that really brings the whole world together and brings people together in a very solemn way that few other things do. This is the second time in my life that a sitting Pope has passed. This is the third Pope in my lifetime. So, you know, in my childhood, it was John Paul II who was Pope, and I was raised a Catholic. So, you know, at the time, I remember attending a special Mass to commemorate Pope John Paul II when he passed in 2005. And it was a very solemn event, and there were lots of people there. And I still remember the atmosphere very vividly. And then there was Pope Benedict XVI, who of course resigned as Pope before he passed, followed by Francis, who now in the last few days has passed. The funeral service will be beginning probably over the next day or so. A very momentous event for the world. And a lot of people are buzzing about this event. The huge impact that it has on the church, the Catholic Church around the world, of course, but also people are talking about this event for other reasons that are connected to an expectation that we are entering or have entered the end times. A prophecy, aptly named the Prophecy of the Popes, which lists a number of popes from the time that the prophecy was supposedly given until the end of the world. And when the list runs out, that means that the end has come. And people are saying that we are at the end or approaching the end of the list, as I will explain in this video. So I wanted to do a video exploring the prophecy of the popes, whether it's legit or not, and what kind of predictions are made about the future by this prophecy. So the Prophecy of the Popes was first published in 1595 by a monk called Arnold Wion, but it is attributed to a saint and ecclesiastical figure from the 12th century, so about 400 odd years earlier, known as St Malachy. St Malachy was native to Ireland, where he was a bishop, and at one point in his life he travelled to the city of Rome. And while he was in Rome, he had a vision of the future and recorded that vision, and that is the source of the prophecy of the popes. St Malachy wrote down his vision, and then it was stored in the Vatican secret archives until it was rediscovered in 1590. At least that is the story we are given for the origin of this prophecy. And in the prophecy of the popes, St Malachy names 112 popes from his own time until the end of the world. And the first 111 popes are simply named with reference to a motto, a very short motto that applies to each of them. And then the final pope is given a kind of name or pseudonym, and then there's a kind of explanation of other things that are going on at the end, accompanying that. And that's the 112th name that appears on the list. In the final persecution of the Holy Roman Church, there will sit Peter the Roman, who will pasture his sheep in many tribulations, and when these things are finished, the city of 7 hills will be destroyed, and the dreadful judge will judge his people. The end. Now, this is a very cryptic prophecy which requires a little bit of an explanation. The fact that this final pope, Peter the Roman, or Petrus Romanus in the original Latin, will pasture his sheep is an obvious reference to the pastoral care role of the Pope being the shepherd of the flock, that is the Catholic Church, the people of the Church, much the same as Jesus was the Good Shepherd. The many tribulations is a reference most likely to the time of tribulation or Great Tribulation that is mentioned in the Bible, both in the Olivet Discourse of Jesus in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation. This corresponds to a time of final persecution for the church in the end days. And that's why a final persecution is also mentioned in this prophecy. The city on 7 hills is, of course, Rome, which was widely regarded as a city that sits on 7 hills and cryptically referred to by that kind of moniker within the Bible, in the book of Revelation, where it's used as a reference to the woman Babylon who rides upon the scarlet beast. It's said that she sits upon 7 hills, and the seven-hilled city was understood as Rome. She sits upon the beast, which was also understood as a symbol of the Roman Empire. So the city on 7 hills is very much a reference to the city of Rome being destroyed. And indeed, Babylon the Great, the city Babylon, which is a symbolic reference to Rome, is destroyed in the last days in the book of Revelation. And the terrible judge who judges his people can only be a reference to the returned Christ, who comes in the end days to implement the final judgment. Now, the reason why so many people are talking about the prophecy of the popes again, now that Pope Francis has passed, is because as a result of Pope Francis passing, we are very close to the end of the prophecy. The 111th Pope on the list, before those final 2 lines of the prophecy, was the glory of the olive. And this is widely accepted as being a reference to Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict XVI appears in the right order of the successive popes from St Malachy's time down to number 111 in the list, and his life also matches his motto in the prophecy, which means that there is the time of tribulation and final persecution, and then there will sit Peter the Roman. And so there's a bit of disagreement as to whether this first sentence in the prophecy represents a kind of intermission between the glory of the olive and Peter the Roman, or if Peter the Roman succeeds the glory of the olive directly. If it's the latter, then Peter the Roman has just passed on, and there's just the destruction of Rome and the second coming to go. But if there is a bit of a gap, then we're still close to the end. But the next pope to succeed Francis could well be this Peter the Roman, and could well be the last pope according to this prophecy. And I'll get into my thoughts on that later, but first there is an important question to consider, and that is whether or not the prophecy of the popes is really authentic. There have been a few inconsistencies that have been pointed out which are quite telling, I think. One is that the first 74 popes in the list up to the year 1590 are predicted very accurately, and after 1590 the prophecy becomes more vague. And indeed 1595, just 5 years later, is when the prophecy of the popes was first published, even though it was attributed to the much earlier St Malachy. So this suggests that the document didn't originate with St Malachy, but was actually a forgery of the 16th century. In addition, Pope number 75 in the list is seen as a reference to a particular cardinal who was seen as the most likely candidate to become the next pope at the time the prophecy of the popes would have been forged, shortly before it was published, in around 1590. The 75th motto in the prophecy is "From the Old City." And there was a cardinal who was said to be the person referred to, intended to be referred to by this part of the prophecy. From Orvieto, a word which means old city, in Italian derived from Latin. And so it was seen as an obvious reference to this likely successor to the Pope at the time, who was Pope Urban VII. But instead, Pope Urban VII was succeeded by another cardinal, Nicholas Sfondrati, who became Pope Gregory XIV. And Sfondrati's father came instead from Milan. But this could be seen as still fulfilling the prophecy, because Milan itself was an old city, having been founded in 400 BC. But admittedly, the evidence for this being a 16th century forgery, at least from the list up until the 74th or 75th Pope, is quite compelling. And for the skeptics, this is evidence enough to throw it out. It's just a scam. We don't need to think about the prophecy of the popes again. And then there are people who want to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, no, this is definitely legit from start to finish. But I think there's another possibility, and that is that the prophecy of the popes from 1590 onwards was the genuine result of some kind of visionary experience that somebody had about the future. And in order to lend more weight to their vision, they attributed it to a person in the past, a saint who lived in the past who was already famous, and they added the first 74 popes, which were already known, to make the prophecy seem more compelling. And so it's a bit of a dirty trick to make a visionary experience seem more impressive than it really is, but it doesn't debunk the rest of the prophecy. And in fact, in Western esotericism, this is quite common. There's lots of grimoires which are attributed to a particular Egyptian magus or to Moses or Solomon, which don't actually date back that far, but which borrow the identity of that person to lend credibility to the text. And the first 5 books of the Bible do this as well. They most certainly were not authored by Moses himself, and in fact there are 4 separate sources for the Torah, none of which is Moses, most likely. But it's attributed to Moses to lend it that weight. And, you know, even in something like the Theosophical Society, we have Helina Bllovzki, you know, a great juggernaut of spirituality, undoubtedly passed on some very legitimate wisdom and had some very legitimate innovations into understanding spirituality, some very legitimate insights into that world that she passed down. But she was also involved in spiritualism and a lot of fraudulent kind of spiritist kind of activities. And that was shown to be the case. That was proven. But that doesn't disprove or discount all the other wisdom teachings that she passed on. It just means that she needed to pull a few tricks to give herself more publicity, which is not a justification for it, not a moral justification by any means, but it is a thing that happens, is what I'm demonstrating. And so the latter part of the prophecy of the popes may well be the genuine article, notwithstanding there is a part of it that can be demonstrated to be a forgery. And so a better way to ascertain the legitimacy or not of the prophecy of the popes is to look at the popes numbered 76 through to 111 and see if the mottos match. Now, a lot of the mottos are very vague, and some of them seem spot on, even spookily so, in describing a particular pope. But what the skeptics will say is, oh, you know, they're so vague that they could mean anything. They'll say things like, it's not clear how it refers to this particular pope, or, you know, if you stretch the meaning this way, then it might fit. Or, you know, they also say, this is clearly meant to be referring to something on heraldry, on the coat of arms of a particular pope, but they don't have that on the coat of arms, therefore it's not true. There's a lot of assumptions in there about what a motto or a prophecy is supposed to be pointing to in a pope's life. And when the assumption isn't proven, it's taken as proof that the prophecy is incorrect. And that's a very unscientific way of approaching the prophecies. When it comes to receiving visions in the spirit, often things are very symbolic and not very literal and open to interpretation in lots of different ways. Perhaps there's multiple different ways that a particular prophecy could be fulfilled. And so, you know, a prophecy being vague is not a discrediting of it by any means. And I think with some of the older popes in particular, you know, we didn't know as much about people's lives as we do in modern times because we didn't have the same information technology and rapid communication and extensive record keeping that we have today. But if you look at some of the more modern popes, the prophecy of the popes is quite striking in its accuracy on many counts. So let's take 3 of the most recent popes in recorded history, starting with John Paul I. In the prophecy of the popes, John Paul I is referred to as the half moon. That's his motto. John Paul I was born in Belluno, which means beautiful moon, and he was made pope during a half moon. So, a clear fulfillment of the prophecy. Pope John Paul II was referred to as the labour of the sun in the prophecy of the popes. And, much like we see the sun travelling through the sky across the world, rising and setting across the world as the world turns, John Paul II was the most travelled pope in world history. He travelled around the world fighting against communism and doing all sorts of really impressive things. He was born during a solar eclipse, and his funeral also occurred during a solar eclipse, the labour of the sun. And succeeding John Paul II was Pope Benedict XVI, who is predicted as the glory of the olive. Pope Benedict XVI took the name of St Benedict, inspired by the life of St Benedict, the founder of the Benedictine order. And one of the branches, if you will, of the Benedictine order is the Olivetans, who have the olive as their symbol. And so this again can be seen as a fulfillment of the prophecy. But what about Pope Francis and Peter the Roman? Is there a connection between those two? Well, I would argue that there's not really a clear connection between Pope Francis and the motto of Peter the Roman. People have tried to say that he took the name of Francis, and Francis's father's name was Peter, and he has Italian heritage, therefore he's Roman. It just seems like a bit of a stretch. And particularly if there is a possibility that the next pope after the glory of the olive doesn't have to be Peter the Roman, I don't think that Pope Francis has to fulfill the prophecy, and the fact that he's now passed on, unless Christ returns and Rome is destroyed before a new pope is elected, it wasn't him. So either the next pope or one of the subsequent popes might instead fulfill the prophecy of Peter the Roman, which begs the question, could the next pope to succeed Francis be Peter the Roman? Is there a way that we can look at the possibility of somebody who is a front runner for the papacy of fulfilling that prophecy? And it's interesting to consider because out of all of the people that are tapped as the front runners for the papacy, there's 3 candidates who are named Peter. There's Peter Turkson, Peter Erdo, and Pietro Parolin. And of those 3, Pietro Parolin is actually Italian. So, if Pietro Parolin becomes the next pope, then that is a clear fulfillment of the prophecy of a person becoming the pope who would be Peter the Roman. It's hard to get a more fitting fulfillment than that. But even if one of the other 2 Peters got it, there might be something else connecting them to Rome, whether it's sitting on a particular council or whatever that might be. So, it's definitely within the realm of possibility. But I think if it's Pietro Parolin, I think it's hard to argue against the proposition that Peter the Roman is our next pope, which means the end is very close if the prophecy is to be believed. The other thing to consider is what some of the symbolism behind a name like Petrus Romanus or Peter the Roman could be. The prophecy seems to be saying that this final pope will be like a second Peter, as in the Apostle Peter, the very first pope. And if you think about what happened in the life of the Apostle Peter, he was the Bishop of Rome, he travelled to Rome, and he endured severe persecution at the hands of the imperial Roman state, which was described in Revelation as the beast system. So perhaps as the Roman beast system persecuted St. Peter in those days of the church, this second Peter will also be leading his flock in a time of persecution by a Rome-like system, which is anti-Christian by definition. And we see a lot of the modern secular world starting to take on those sorts of characteristics more and more. Whatever your interpretation of the end times is, or the end of the age is, this prophecy, the events in the coming days with the election of a new pope may well be a portent of that end times being with us. But there are a lot of prophecies about the future out there that are circulating. It's hard to know which ones are reliable and which ones aren't. I think that when you've got something that comes from a widely agreed holy text or widely kind of agreed wisdom teachings, which it can be demonstrated have been passed down for hundreds of years, that is the most kind of persuasive, authoritative text, in my opinion, to give prophetic insights into the future. Or unless it's got a very good track record of prediction, that can be another indication. But it is interesting that this prophecy is out there and that it seems to be close to fulfillment. So I'm sure that people will be watching the events of the next few days very closely to see if there's any signs of the end that come about as a result of them. But in this video, I've tried to give a kind of measured but not too skeptical analysis of the prophecy of the popes and my thoughts on the prophecy, and I hope that it's been informative. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe to my channel to support my work, and if you want to support me further, hit join or thanks down below. But thank you again for listening, and I'll see you next time.